Well, good morning, everybody. Hey, before I begin today's sermon, I got this short little video that I want you to watch. Mary, we got that video queued up?
Imagine a church where every member is passionately,
Turn that volume up.
wholeheartedly, and recklessly calling the shots.
I have a busy work week, and by the time Sunday rolls around, I'm tired. So how about a church service that starts when I get here?
Can do. When you arrive, we begin.
This guy, he plays by his own rules. We want to find a church where if he starts screaming, we're not the bad guy.
Say no more. If your baby's screaming, you stay seated. The others around you.
Let me tell you what happened in the video. How about that? So the video starts out and it asks you this question. It says, what if there was a church where you were wholeheartedly and passionately and recklessly in charge of everything? And then it has all these little interviews with people. There's this lady that comes on and she says, you know, I work hard all week. I'm really busy. When I wake up on Sunday morning, I'm tired. How about a church that starts when I get there? And then there's this voice in the background that says, you got it. We'll start church when you get there. And then there's this couple they interview, and they've got a little baby, and they say, you know, this little guy, he's pretty much in charge of our world. We want a church where if the baby starts crying and going crazy, we're not the bad guys. And the church voice says, you got it. If your baby starts crying, we'll make everybody else leave, and you can stay. And then there's this couple that says, you know, we don't really give much money to the church, but we sure like to know who does. And the church says, you got it. We'll show you the giving statements of everybody in the church. And then it just kind of goes on from there, you know. The church says, if you pull up in our parking lot, we'll detail your car and give you an oil change while you're worshiping God. And it's just all that they make this point over and over. And it's really funny. I'm not doing it justice. It's funny when you watch it. But the point is a lot of us kind of expect church to cater to us. And when we come here so often, and our mindset is, what am I going to get? What's the church going to give to me? Instead of, what can I bring to God? What do I have to give today? And so many times people come to church as though they were entitled to be here. They come to church as though they're doing God some favor by coming here. And that's going to kind of feed into the sermon today. I wish you could have just seen the video, but it's okay. Yeah, I'll show it another time. So we are now 6 weeks into this sermon series called The Greatest Story Ever Told. And this series is taking us through the whole Bible. And we're seeing that this really is the greatest story ever told. But the main purpose of this series, it's not just for you to learn the Bible stories. It's so that you learn that the greatest story ever told is a story that is all about you. So last week we were in the book of Exodus. And God had rescued the Israelites from slavery. And now they're out there in the wilderness. And there's no food and no water. But God keeps showing up. God keeps providing for His people. He gives them food. He gives them water. God keeps giving His people everything that they really need. And so the Israelites are learning this lesson. They're learning that God is all that they need. And as long as they seek Him and depend on Him, they're going to be okay. They're going to be okay. And they cannot be defeated because God is on their side. Did you hear what I said? They cannot be defeated because God is on their side. How would you live your life if you knew that you could not be defeated? And I don't mean like you would always have success in everything that you did. I mean, like, what if you knew every day that you were in the hands of a loving and powerful God, and He's on your side, and He's going to win? God is going to win, and you belong to Him. And since God is going to win, and you belong to Him, you cannot be defeated. Yeah. You cannot be defeated, not by sin, not by shame, not by guilt, not by fear, not by failure, not by loss, not even by death. Not even death can defeat you. I mean, what if you knew that there's nothing that this world can throw at you that could ever defeat you? How would you live? How would you live? Well, there's a word for this kind of living in the Bible. The Bible calls it this. The Bible calls it worship. You see, so often people think of worship as just what we do when we come here, and we pray our prayers and we sing our songs and we listen to a sermon. But worship goes much, much deeper than that. Worship is a way of life. It's not just what you do for an hour on Sunday morning. It's how you live your whole life. And there's no way you can live your life and not worship. Everybody worships. If you don't worship God, you're going to worship something else. You'll worship money. You'll worship stuff. You'll worship popularity or success or your sports team. But everybody worships. And as we continue our journey through the Bible, this week we're going to look at how God teaches His people to worship. And I really hope that you're starting to see this pattern develop. As we journey through the early books of the Bible, there's this pattern where God is building His people. He's building His people, and it's one stage after another stage. It's one lesson after another lesson. It's this process where God is building His people into the people He can call His own. And the first lesson, the first stage, God taught His people to obey Him. That's the first lesson. Remember the first week we talked about the creation story. He taught Adam and Eve to obey, but they failed, right? They failed in that lesson. And so in the next week we saw God came to this man Abraham, still teaching his people to obey. He tells Abraham to go from his country. Go to this land I will show you. He tells Abraham to go, and Abraham obeyed. He tells Abraham to go, and Abraham went. God, that's the first stage. God's teaching His people to obey Him. And then last week, we saw how God starts teaching His people to trust Him. They're out in the wilderness, no food or water, but God keeps showing up for them. Keeps providing what they need. See, God is teaching His people to trust Him. So God is building these people, and it's one stage after another. He teaches them to obey Him, and then He teaches them to trust Him, And this week we're going to see how God teaches his people to worship him. And people don't know how to do this. I mean, they don't know. How could they? They've been living as slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And now they're out there in that wilderness and they don't know how to worship God. They just don't know. And so the next thing that we're going to see happen in the book of Exodus is God comes to these people and he tells them, he says, look, I've been building you. I've been building you. Now it's time for you to build something for me. He says, I want you to build a house for me. The Bible calls it a tabernacle. Just a fancy word for a big tent, really. But this is going to be the place where God lives with his people. This is God's house. And God tells the people, every time you look at that tabernacle, every time you set foot in that tabernacle, I want you to remember that you are not alone. That I am with you. I'm gonna be right there in that tabernacle. And I'm going to use that place that you build to teach you how to worship me. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. How to worship God. And what we're going to see is this is something that involves our whole lives. Everything that we are and everything that we have, it's all part of how we worship God. And it's no coincidence that today is also the day that we're going to hand out the pledge cards for our capital campaign. And we've been talking about this for the last month, trying to prepare your hearts. See, just like the Israelites did out there in the wilderness, we built this house for God. We built this house as an act of worship to God. And this house of God has stood for 113 years. Some of you here today have spent your whole lives right here in this church. Some of you are still fairly new to this church. But we all love this church. And the question that God is putting before you today is, do you love this church enough to make some real sacrifices for her? 113 years is a long time. We can look back on 113 years of history. But today's not about looking back. Today's about looking forward. And that's why we're calling this campaign our 2020 vision. Because the year 2020 is just 5 years away. And all the money we raise in this campaign is going to be used to make the repairs that have to be made here in the next 5 years. And the simple truth is, if we don't make these repairs, if we don't fix the things that have to be fixed, this church might not be here in 5 years. We've got plaster walls that are falling apart. We've got a roof that is leaking. The entire brick exterior of the church has to be repaired. We have to replace every window in the building, including these windows in the sanctuary. We have to repave the parking lot. We need a whole new sound system in here. It's a lot that has to get done. And we went out and we got estimates for all the work, and the number that came back was shocking to us. It's a big number. We have to raise $175,000. And that's a big number, right? It's not as big as our God, right? It's a big number, but our God is bigger. And every one of you is going to get a pledge card today, and you're going to be asked to make a real sacrifice for the future of this church, but only if you're willing. See, that's key to this whole thing. We only want you to give if you give from a willing heart. We don't want you to give if you give out of a sense of obligation. We don't want you to give because you're going to feel guilty if you don't give. We only want those gifts that come from a willing heart. And at the end of service today, we're going to collect your pledge cards. But it may be that you're not ready to turn it in. There might be a few of you who you need to take that pledge card with you this week, and you need to talk to your family about it, or you need to talk to God about what you can give, and that's fine. Here's what I know. I know we can get this done. I know we can. But I also know it's going to take some real sacrifices on your part. And here's what you need to know. You need to know that the elders of this church, those 6 men, they put up the first 10% of this money themselves. And then the deacons and the staff of this church, they put up the next 15%. So just with your leadership, we've already got the first 25% of this money. And that's important for you to know. You need to know that your leaders are out front on this. You need to know how committed the leaders are to this. But the rest is up to you. I don't like asking for money. It makes me uncomfortable. But it's not me asking. It's God asking. It's for His house. This is for God. And when you are willing to sacrifice part of you for Him, that goes right to the heart of what worship is all about. In fact, that's the very first thing that God taught His people about how to worship. First thing He taught them that worship is costly. He taught them that there is no worship without sacrifice. We're in Exodus 25. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering for me from each man whose heart prompts him to give. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them." This is the very first lesson in worship. God starts on this right away. First thing God tells them is that worship is costly. And He tells them that there is no worship without sacrifice. But it has to be a willing sacrifice. It has to come from those whose hearts are prompted to give. And this is fascinating to me. God says to take the offering only from those whose hearts are prompted to give. Only take the offering from those whose hearts are willing to give. In other words, this is voluntary, right? I mean, that's what God is saying here. This is not mandatory. This is voluntary. It's voluntary, but it's not cheap. God goes on. These are the offerings you are to receive from them: gold, silver and bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine linen. All of those things are really, really valuable. And the list goes on from there. That's not the whole list. God goes on, lists all these things like precious gems and the finest oils, and everything on that list is really, valuable. God is telling them that worship is going to be costly. But there's a reason for this, you see. And it's the same reason that wedding bands are made out of gold. It's because when you really love someone, you want to give your very best. When you really love someone, you want to give them those things that are valuable. When you really love someone, you want to make those sacrifices. You want to. You're willing in your heart. And the people, they get this. They get it. And they love God so much that they want to make these sacrifices. And so they start giving. God tells them to give, they start giving. And they keep giving, and they keep giving. And it's really sacrificial giving. It's really, really costing them something. And then the most amazing thing happens. I want to tell you this as plainly as I can. There are so many miraculous, amazing things that happen in the Bible, but this one amazes me beyond words. These people love God so much. They want His house to be a place of honor so much. And so they give so much that God actually has to ask them to stop giving. They give so much that God has to come and say, stop. That's enough. Look, Exodus 36 now. Then Moses gave an order, and they sent this word through the camp. No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary. And so the people were restrained from bringing more because what they had was more than enough to do all the work. That's amazing, isn't it? I mean, that's a miracle. And this is something that happened. Once upon a time, there was this group of people who wanted to honor God so much that they gave everything they could to build His house. God asked them to do it, and they did it. And they gave generously, and they gave willingly, they gave sacrificially, and they gave so much that God had to say, stop! Stop giving now. We have enough. I tell you, of all the miracles in the Bible, that one's pretty close to the top of my list. And I make this promise to you. When we reach our goal, when we see that miracle happen here, the leaders of this church are going to stand up here and tell you the same thing God told them. We're going to tell you that what you've given is more than enough to do all the work. So today we're asking you to give. I'm looking forward to the day we have to ask you to stop giving. Amen? Amen. Well, the next thing God teaches His people about worship is that worship has to be the very center of your whole life. First, He tells them to make worship costly. And then the next thing He tells them is to make worship central. Make worship central. And it's so cool the way God teaches them this lesson. See, all nations at the time, they all had temples, right? They all had places they would go to worship their gods. Now, every nation other than Israel, they had lots of them. Lots of these temples that people could go to. But Israel was different. Israel only had one. One temple for the whole nation. I mean, think about that. We're used to seeing churches on every other street. They had one. Just one. One temple for the whole nation. Why is that? Why did Israel only have one? Because God wanted worship to be at the center of everything else. And so God gives very clear instructions about how to build this temple, and then He gives very clear instructions about where to put this temple. Take a look at this diagram. You see that structure right there at the center? You know what that is, don't you? That's the tabernacle. That is God's house. This is Israel at the time of Exodus. And all the tribes, all the camps, all the people, they're in a formation around God's house, but God's house is at the very center. Imagine you were there. Just picture yourself there for a minute. And you're just going through your day, and you get mad at somebody. You want to hurt somebody, or you want to take something that doesn't belong to you, or you're thinking about cheating somebody, or you're lusting after somebody. But then you look over, and there's God's house right there. And you remember, God is right here. He's not a distant God. He's right here. I can see His house. And He can see me. It was a constant reminder to the people to live their lives and treat other people as though God was right there with them, because He was. God was right there. His house is at the center of everything else. See, God is teaching His people that worship has to be at the center of your life. And that's why His house is at the center of everything else. And every day at that tabernacle, if you were to walk in the front doors of that tabernacle, any day, every day, you walk in those doors, there's two things you would see right away. You would see this golden lampstand that was lit every day, and you'd see this table where fresh bread was laid out every day. These were instructions from God, and they were very meaningful. I mean, think about this. This is God's house. This is where God lives. And every day, the lampstand is lit, and there's bread on the table. What do those things mean? What's the message? When the light is on and there's bread on the table, what does that mean? It means that somebody's home, amen? It means that the owner of the house is home. And that lampstand and that bread, it's a message to the people. It's telling them, you are welcome here. And I'm going to feed you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to lead